Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. A realist PhD can be a deeply rewarding, fulfilling, and even fun experience. It gives you powerful ways of understanding the world and equips you with research skills that stay with you for life. Many students take on this journey full time, immersing themselves in the research every day. But for others, the path looks a little different. They choose to do their PhD part time, often alongside work, family, or other life commitments. Given the demanding and iterative nature of realist research, how do part time students manage the balance? What are the biggest challenges they face? And what strategies actually help? In today's episode, I'm joined by a colleague from the Division of Health Research at Lancaster University, who's here to share her part time PhD journey, the highs, the hurdles, and how she's navigating it all. Michele Wood, welcome and good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Alejandro. It's really lovely to be here and to be in conversation with you about what has been continues to be a challenging journey.
No worries, Michelle. Thanks to you, because I've heard you speak before in some of the conversations we've had at DHR and the work that you're doing, and I really find it fascinating. Not only the topic itself, but also how you're dealing with the intricacies of realist work and realist PhDs in a part-time setting. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But just before we get started, would you mind just sharing a little bit more about yourself and your research and what made you interested in realist approaches in the first place?
So I'm an art psychotherapist working in palliative care, and I've been working in palliative care for the last 30 plus years. I was introduced to technology by my patients and became fascinated with how it could expand the work of emotionally supporting patients and their carers, but in a setting where technology was not valued by the organization. So this became a real sort of a hobby horse for me, led me into considering PhD studies, and I got funded to do a part-time PhD. So my research project came into focus from an uncomfortable place in my clinical practice because I could see it could benefit patients, but the organization was very much against it. And then we had COVID and all the restrictions using video conferencing were lifted. And so I became even more interested in understanding what are the barriers, what are the facilitators for making a change in clinical practice. So that sort of led me to my topic and being a part timer.
Fascinating, Michelle. And you've probably seen so much change in those 30 years that you're speaking about. I can only think of how technology started and then how it's developed and how fast it's developing indeed in this field and in many others. From a realist perspective, that's such an interesting way into what is it about this technology that makes it useful or indeed not useful for some of the settings that you're working in specifically. So you mentioned around your approach and your research with palliative care and that technology that you mentioned, particularly with some of the changes through COVID. So, what is it that made you choose a realist approach for your PhD? And how has that shaped your research journey so far?
So I guess context is everything. And when I was thinking about the approach I would take to understanding this topic that I was fascinated by, I kind of realized I wanted to make a difference to the delivery of care to more people. So I think the realist sort of approach of looking at the kind of real world application of research really ticked a box for me. The kind of realist perspective, which is looking at what's underneath the surface, looking at what kind of drives certain behaviors, resonated and resonates deeply with my own work as a psychotherapist, where I'm always looking behind what people might be kind of struggling with. Where might that have come from? What are the contextual historical factors driving that? So my approach to thinking about social psychological issues resonated a lot with a kind of realist philosophy. So that opened me up as well. So that the idea that research can make a difference in the real world, understanding where it works well, where it doesn't, as well as, and I know you don't want to use jargon, but I definitely think the kind of ontological stance um, of realism it just made complete sense to me. So when I was, working my way through the reading, realism seemed to fit very well with my own kind of values and approaches. I hadn't realized quite how difficult it is when I sort of embraced it.
Certainly, Michelle, and we'll go into speak around that complexity within your context as well. But can I say that I think a lot of people go through that process when they discover some of the underpinnings of the realist world, or the realist lens, as we call it, and this view of the world. I think particularly in mental health that you're speaking about, and many other fields as well, of course, like education or policy, etc. And it does seem to illustrate some of the things that we see in practice and that we see in the real world. And that's one of the things
Mhm.
that I can completely concur that attracted me to the approach. And I found that fascinating as well. And one of the things that you mentioned from a realist perspective is that context is everything. And you're in a very particular context, which is, of course, managing your PhD part time from a realist perspective whilst doing other commitments. So, how are you managing those unique challenges and balancing and juggling all those things at the same time? Because, as you mentioned, it's not the easiest approach to deal with, let alone with other commitments that also require much of your attention.
Yes, I mean, it is really quite hard. When I started my PhD, my mother had a stroke and was dramatically hospitalized, and I was working in a university that was on strike. And then we had COVID. The context sort of just tied together the personal and the professional. And my PhD became almost like a little haven that I could retreat from these bigger demands. So the intensity of the outside world and the personal world also resonated and fitted with my topic area, so which is about healthcare and healthcare systems. So I was having to navigate the healthcare system as a relative and dealing with my mother. And I was also practicing in a healthcare system myself, and I was teaching people who were training to be therapists. So, on one level, it was absolutely fascinating. Everything came together and it was incredibly rich. It still is, because I'm drawing from these lots and lots of different perspectives. And again, in terms of a kind of realist approach, those kind of different levels of, the actual, the real, the empirical, my experiences sort of move me up and down through them. And again, the realist lens has enabled me to keep things in focus. So that's on a kind of, an intellectual level. Practically, I've just had to carve out time to go into the sort of depths of the darkness um, by using timetabling, the basic things, doing Gantt charts. One of the tools that I've found really helpful in doing my PhD was based on a book, something I picked up in a book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. That has really helped me. And so he has a kind of recommendation about making lists and blocking out 30-minute slots and prioritizing. It's all the things that you'll read in time management books, but having a good grasp of time management has been helpful, as well as valuing, I suppose, my long story about my mother and work. It is kind of really valuing the experiences of our lives as a resource for academic work.
And I say, Michelle, that thank you for sharing all that, because I think that what you're doing there is a fantastic reminder of being human first, researcher
Mm,
second, because a lot of the time we're in autopilot and just trying to hit deadlines or to read that book or that chapter or feeling, a little bit overwhelmed if we haven't reached something. But after all, we're navigating the complexity of human life at the same time, specifically
mm,
through part-time work where things happen. And of course, in full-time work, that's as well, all these elements that can occur that can be not, I don't want to use the word distractions, but they're not distractions, they're just added layers of attention that you need to place. Thank you for sharing that, and for, just as I say, humanizing research and PhD journeys, because I think that's super important in times where it feels that there's pressure and you lose perspective,
mm.
and just zooming out and looking at the bigger picture can be really useful. And sometimes when we zoom out and look at those gaps and those strategies, that can be a really powerful thing to try and deal with those challenges and to try and deal with the complexity of balancing all these things, either as a part-time student or also full-time. So you've mentioned, the book as well, and around your time management skills, so like timetable and Gantt charts. But are there any other strategies that have helped you stay connected and maintain momentum over what we call a marathon and not a sprint, which is a PhD journey, right? And, with so many things that, particularly with the iterative nature of realist research, that isn't necessarily linear, and you may go back and forth, and there
Mm.
may be differences and changes that occur. There has probably been some strategies that have helped you through that, and I'd love to hear more about those.
I think definitely keeping a reflective journal of just you know, an outpouring of thoughts has been helpful. So I do that every day. I'll write something, and that's just a bit free flowing. Writing is also thinking, and I found that really helpful. Of not necessarily doing the kind of academic writing or trying to make a kind of structured narrative, but just really just allowing words to tumble out because they bring with them a kind of sequence of hidden gems, or they clear the kind of emotional blocks out of the way. So regular reflective journaling, I have a sort of, I call it my PhD reflective diary. In addition to that, memos I have found incredibly helpful because the realist endeavor is so iterative. Decisions made at one point lead one way, and then you find that you're coming back to the same point, but with a different set of information, or different understanding, a little bit deeper. And then another memo, but then seeing that in relation to the decision that was made 3 months ago. Um, and so I have been using OneNote in Microsoft Teams to kind of just journal my decisions, and also I have compiled a study bank where all the papers that I come across and read, there's a little summary that I make on them, and then also my own notes and the connections that those particular papers have for the kind of theory that's emerging, not only the program theory thoughts, but also the theory that I'm trying to interrogate through my research. So I'm just keeping a list of papers that I may or may not kind of use in a kind of systematic way, but also leaving breadcrumbs. Yeah, so the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel. And the children are taken into the forest and they leave a trail of stones so they can find their way out again. And then obviously then they leave a trail of breadcrumbs which get eaten and lost so they can't find their way out again. So I'm trying to leave a trail of stones so that when I leave a bit of thinking and working, I've left what I've thought about, what I did, what I might need to do next. And then I've got to go off and go to work or deal with other life situations. Research brain turns off. So then I can go back to those pebbles that I've dropped. So I have a document in my OneDrive, which is pebbles through the forest, so that I can keep dropping in kind of notes and things so I don't get lost.
That's such a beautiful analogy, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that, because I think, particularly for PhD students, when it comes to the Viva or justifying their decisions and the choices that they've made along the way, that is such a useful way to remind ourselves of those decisions, for transparency as well into how you got there. And I know it seems like a lot of work and, doing it all the time, but it's so worth it at the end when you see that. And I guess that from what you mentioned into getting into those decisions and those pebbles, because you might get to the same stone 4 times, but that is
Mhm.
progress. Just because you
Yeah.
got back to the other stone, to the same stone, but you got more information that's going to take you to a slightly different route. That's progress. And I guess that particularly for students who may have, or researchers or evaluators who may be more used to linear ways of thinking, that iterative process that you mentioned and those little stones. And that is a process that can be embraced as well and is celebrated in an iterative manner to get to those places. Obviously, as well, making those pragmatic decisions into how you're going to advance. But I don't know how you find that reflection around embracing that iterative process.
The iterative process is like going up a mountain, round and round and round and round and round. So it's only when you kind of stop, you realize how far you've come. And certainly in revisiting ideas that I've had, I've just seen how much I've learned. And I sort of come back and it's like, oh, wow, you can see it in a different way and a different way. So, it really, the going round and round can also be like being in a washing machine, but one's thinking comes out clearer and crisper from the iterative process. So they're my kind of like two metaphors, going up a mountain and going through a wash.
Whilst leaving those breadcrumbs along the way, indeed, and those stones. So that's fantastic. That's beautifully positioned, Michelle, and very very vivid. Those images to understand the process. Certainly, many people will relate to that. And as you've gone through those mountains and through those washing machines and through those decisions that have got you to where you are today, because you say that you started a few years ago since the project, and there has probably been a lot of learning. And I think any PhD is a process of learning and development. I always see it as the start, not the end. The start of something next, of the next stage, of the next process, a learning process and training process to try and really get that thinking going. So looking back into that journey that you've had so far, what changes would you have made to your PhD journey, to either balance in this part-time world or within your methodology or within your ideas? Are there any changes you would have made looking back?
Yeah, definitely. I think my kind of enthusiasm and passion to do this meant that I tried to put as many PhD learning activities in. So I kind of tried to cram in lots of different ways of doing things. So for example, my project is underpinned, it rests on a realist perspective, but I'm doing a case study and I'm doing a multi-site case study, and I am very committed to PPI. So I managed to get some funds to support PPI in my study, and I am also very keen to make sure that my informants have as broad a way to communicate their experiences as possible. I have one of my research methods is collage making. So I have lots and lots of different ways to gather data, and the data themselves bring with them lots of values and challenges. So looking back, I would probably have have advised myself to be much simpler and not quite so over ambitious in terms of what I wanted to do. But also, I suppose it's all part of the learning. One of one of the things is understanding how my therapist mind really loves the kind of realist stance on looking at contexts triggering certain responses leading to certain outcomes, really fits with my therapist mind. But my therapist mind as a researcher is in tension with how the realist researcher interacts with the participants, which is there's the power dynamic as I've understood it. And obviously, I'm a novice realist researcher, but the power dynamic of the researcher to the informant which I guess is summarized in the teacher learner description, um, slightly rubs against the way I would interact as a therapist. So while I've been trying to collapse the power differential, the realist researcher, as I've understood it, doesn't do that. Particularly if you're taking theory and presenting it to your informants, you start off with a kind of teacher perspective, which changes in the course of data collection. So there are these misalignments or potential misalignments in the research methodology and methods that I probably wished I'd paid more attention to. I mean, I don't think I'm going wildly off track with my research, but I've just made things more difficult for myself by having too many things in the mix.
Well, that's two such important topics that I think every PhD student, researcher, evaluator will go through. And you talk around that feasibility, which again, for
Mm.
any project to be feasible is so important. And as PhD students, it is true that there's so much you want to do and so many, kind of change the world, right? In 3, 4 years. But
Yeah.
I always see the PhD project as a grain of sand in the Sahara Desert. And a lot of those little grains of sand are going to create what we call science or we call knowledge or however you want to call it. So certainly make it feasible. You can't build a dune, but you can certainly build those little grains of sand to help you in that process. The other one, that misalignment, I think it's so important. And I know that, for instance, the alignment of that ontology, epistemology, methodology, methods, and then results discussion, etc., that can be one of the key areas that can catch people out, not only individually but also sometimes in supervisory relationships, supervision relationships that may have
Yeah.
different slightly ways of seeing the world. So I think just getting alignment and expectations very clear into the
Mm.
project and what you're trying to do, as you mentioned, is super, super important.
One of the things I have really valued about being a part-time student is having the time to work these things out in conversation with my supervisors and with my peers. So I've really valued going slowly and not rushing at it, because this is a kind of once in a lifetime joy being a PhD student, and being able to digest it and dialogue has been a real blessing, actually. So, that's a good thing about being a part-timer.
I love that, Michelle. It reminds me of a quote that I like to use sometimes, which is "slow down to speed up." Which
Mhm.
it gives you an opportunity to really scaffold that process and to think about it. And of course, that's it. It depends on the nature of your circumstances and around your positions and what you want to do. But there's certainly benefits as well of the part-time journey. You've given some real good thoughts and experiences, and what I've loved around the conversation, Michelle, is how humanizing it's been. Of just saying that as a research process, it's humans first, research second, and I think that's a really nice reminder. To wrap up some of the thoughts that you've had, and you've mentioned already some of the ideas and tricks and tips, but if you were to pick three pieces of advice, and I know three is very hard, but if you had to pick three of students or researchers or evaluators thinking around a realist PhD, thinking about this process, doing it in a part-time manner, so a part-time PhD, what would be your top three tips for someone who's considering a part-time PhD? What would you say to them?
Surround yourself with a good supportive network. So that's either your family, but also peers, people that you can talk PhD with. So really having good study buddies. And certainly, that's benefited me from my cohort. It's been absolutely fantastic. So that's supportive networks. The other thing is to keep in your sights why you're doing it. What's the purpose? Build in places to keep reminding yourself of that. So, for example, the accountability of the purpose by having a PPI group or putting yourself forward for giving talks, because there's so much research that's generated that's never used. So I just feel we've got to keep it real. So for me, that's my purpose. Other people might want to do it for ego or creative career progression. But I think know your purpose. And then the third thing is make sure that you have really efficient and elegant storage systems for information. So, where you keep your files. I'm using Atlas TI for helping me with managing all my information and with data analysis, but just really have a clear system for managing your data and information so you don't get lost. So they're my three things.
Surround yourself with a supportive network, purpose and bigger picture, and storage systems that are clear and useful. I think those are three really important points, and I couldn't agree more. As you mentioned that, and as we go through that journey, I think that's really useful from a logistical perspective, from a social perspective, and from an individual perspective. And on that note, Michelle, I'd love to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your stories and your experiences and your journey, because it is certainly a journey that we all go through in this process. And I think that you've made it very human, very relatable, and very, very useful for many people listening. And for anyone listening to today's episode, thank you so much for your time and for listening to another episode of the Realist Lens. And I'm hoping to see you soon. Michelle, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care.